Hello everyone, sorry for the short delay and thank you for showing interest in our workshop series. I'm İlker Kalın. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research at Bilkent University. Today we are here for our second event of four-part workshop series named Local Wisdom and Global Insights. These workshop series are sponsored by the Center and its journal Azimuth, a journal of foreign policy and peace. Both the Center and journal have long fostered scholarly dialogue between the Center and periphery, serving as a platform for scholars from the Global South and a platform for global dialogue. And these workshops also aim to serve to this purpose. For our first event last week, we welcomed Professor Cunningham, and she walked us through the evolution of conflict research in terms of empirical data and methodologies, as well as cooperation between the Global South and the North. And today we are hosting Professors Deniz Aksoy and David Carter to talk about challenges in accessing local knowledge and data. Before I leave the floor to our speakers, I would like to briefly introduce them. Deniz Aksoy is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on political institutions and political violence. She has so far published in numerous journals, including American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, World Politics, British Journal of Political Science, Legislative Studies Quarterly, among other academic journals. And David Carter is professor in the same department at Washington University. His research is in the field of international relations with a special focus on interstate conflict, sub-state political violence. And his research has so far appeared in top journals such as American Political Science Review and international organizations. And without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to you, professors. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, İlker, and thank you to Efe and everyone else at Bilkent for organizing this great event. It's really nice to be involved with this. Professor Aksoy and I will work through some of the questions that the workshop organizers posed to us, which I think are excellent questions for discussion about connecting local knowledge to sort of the global pursuit of knowledge about armed conflict and political violence, and also thinking about how we can leverage insights in various ways from scholars at a range of institutions, in the countries that we're interested in studying, as well as in the United States and Europe and around the world. Right. So one of the questions that we've been thinking about over the past couple of weeks, as we sort of thought forward to this workshop, is the question of sort of how can local knowledge contribute to sort of more contextually relevant conflict resolution strategies, or sort of to better, more full understandings of armed conflicts, either border disputes between pairs of states that have maybe persisted for a long period of time, like we see on the Indian subcontinent, or sort of sub-state territorial conflicts, or other sort of episodes of political violence, right? And like, how can we think about how local context and what NGOs, people working for NGOs, or scholars that have been closer to the conflicts and on the ground have learned, and what scholars with a more sort of global bent who are doing research perhaps that's they're just more removed from the context by virtue of where they live and work, how they can learn from this. And in thinking about this, I started to think a little bit more clearly about trade-off between what I might term sort of general theory, or evidence that we think has some general features that apply across a bunch of cases, right? And that's in the sort of peace science tradition, which, a lot of us in this call, in this room, have sort of a connection to. This work started with a lot of cross-national quantitative empirical work that was quite useful, starting in the 60s, and then really developing in the 80s and 90s and afterwards. But it was quite useful in clarifying some general dynamics that we saw across a bunch of cases. If we look at sort of the population as we see it of militarized interstate disputes, for example, right? And so these sort of general empirical findings connect to general theoretical ideas we have, and these, I think, remain quite useful in thinking about particular contexts. But we can also sort of be blind to dynamics or processes that are important on the ground in a particular conflict, because we are viewing the world a little bit too strictly through some theoretical notion that we could kind of go into the case or into the topic of study already having it at hand, right? And so a little bit of a more concrete example that comes to mind for me is Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom's work on collective action and the problem of managing resources in the commons, right? Where we had this sort of theoretical intuition, and there was some evidence, of course, for some of these ideas as well, that the tragedy of the commons was this general problem where you had resources that could be depleted. The commons problem, as sort of originally espoused by Hardin, was a sort of common grazing area where farmers didn't necessarily have the incentive to limit the amount that their animals were grazing on this sort of common grazing land, because they didn't really have any assurance that anyone else would be doing so, right? So they were just hurting themselves and also not really solving the overall problem. But Ostrom did a lot of important theoretical and empirical work where she looked at indigenous communities and local contexts where solutions had arisen endogenously, that people had come up with solutions to this problem, and the way resource management worked in rural Nepal, for example, areas of Nepal that scholars in the West hadn't paid a lot of attention to previously, it didn't really look like that tragedy of the commons problem at all, right? And so to me, that suggests one of the ways in which local knowledge, or paying a lot of attention to local solutions that have worked on the ground, can help to inform general theory and revise it, right? So that's just sort of a general challenge that I see about balancing sort of general theoretical knowledge and sort of empirical regularities that we've built across a variety of cases and decades of research, but not letting that straitjacket us too much in sort of imposing that sort of preconceived view, or preconceived might be a kind of the wrong word, but that sort of prior idea about how the world works on every local case, but allowing a process where we learn by reading deeply and connecting with people that have been involved with conflict resolution, conflict management, and NGOs, and also scholars that are closer to the case, either just geographically or have been working on it as experts for years or decades. So just one other sort of piece that might sort of connect the dots for those that are sort of inclined to international relations theory. I'm also reminded of some of Robert Jervis's path-breaking work on perception and misperception, where he talks in his, I believe his 1968 World Politics article about how the more sort of ambiguous or uncertain you are about the data, which in this realm you could think about the details of a local conflict setting, the more you lean on whatever theory you sort of have in your hand as your sort of best approximation to understanding what's going on, right? And that's a natural bias that researchers tend to have, but it's something I think we should be aware of as we try to navigate learning more, and also taking seriously the knowledge that local scholars and activists and folks working in NGOs have, as we try to move forward with conflict research. So
Very done. Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I wanted to also, like Professor Carter, thank you all for organizing this wonderful event, to people at the center and the department at Bilkent. I think this is a wonderful opportunity and exactly the type of organization we need to be doing if we are going to contribute to connecting, local experts, local knowledge with, like, how you framed global insights or global researchers. So thank you for putting this event together. I think this was very fruitful for me also, because it kind of gave me an opportunity to think about some of the questions that I don't necessarily think about day to day as I do my research, and probably many of us do not. And one of these questions was, how can local knowledge contribute to more contextually relevant, sustainable conflict resolution strategies? I agree with a lot of the observations and points Professor Carter made on this point, and I'm just going to add a couple of things very briefly, which should be kind of obvious to a lot of us in this room. The first one is that, as you all know, like, local NGOs and locally rooted experts or scholars are, I think, more closely able to observe, like, day-to-day happenings and day-to-day changes on the ground that are happening in the conflict settings, right? They have direct access to government officials, direct access and direct information with other actors on the ground. So they have this advantage of being more aware, maybe, of, actions, policies that parties in the conflict are taking day to day. So I think this can provide the local experts and local NGOs with opportunities to more closely observe what are the priorities of the actors on the ground are, what are some of the policies they are taking on the ground are, and maybe even set up, like, research projects to examine the effectiveness of such policies to resolve conflicts. An example could be, like, government might be starting or promoting or proposing to implement, like, inter-ethnic collaborative educational environments. This can be vocational training or classrooms, etc. This can be an example of a potentially beneficial government policy that is kind of being unfolded on the ground, right? But we can also think about not beneficial, potentially dangerous policies that the governments or the other conflict actors will take. And people on the ground, people who are locally rooted, are, like I mentioned, likely to be more aware of these programs and actions, and they might be able to, set up either program evaluation programs, program evaluation projects to test the effectiveness of these or the impact of these actions more effectively, I think, than people who are kind of out of this setting there, that are not as locally rooted and as not locally well informed. And I think, in a way, like, the prime example of this is what the Evidence in Governance and Politics group, EGAP, is doing. They have partnerships in a lot of local NGOs globally in different countries. They have connections with universities across the globe in different continents, right? And they are really collaborating and leveraging that information and the knowledge the local experts and NGOs have on the ground, and connecting those local experts with, researchers maybe abroad, to find ways to test the effectiveness of the actions that the conflict parties are taking on the ground. And some examples of this is, like, peacekeeping operations in Mali. How can we build trust? Or does UN's implementation of certain type of peacekeeping work or not? The effectiveness of such policies is important to be tested, and they are being tested by, collaborations like this, like in EGAP. Or election safety, availability of election observers, how does that influence election violence, etc. There are just endless number of questions that I think are being tested, studied, thanks to the local knowledge and information provided by the NGOs and locally rooted experts and the, you know, researchers elsewhere that are not necessarily in that locality. So I think local knowledge gives both scholars and NGOs a lot of advantages in identifying these kind of actions and identifying the priorities of the parties in conflict setting, and gives, I think, a lot of opportunities to hopefully test effectiveness of these measures to accomplish, you know, sustainable peacekeeping, I think. Maybe we will move on now then to the second question that we have been thinking about this past week, which is about the primary obstacles faced by researchers who are trying to access and incorporate local knowledge into conflict studies, and how can these problems can be overcome. I mean, this is, again, another, I think, fantastic question. I think a lot of the people who study conflict in different contexts, they actually, a lot of us want to know more about the locality, right? We know the importance of understanding the context, but sometimes we face obstacles to do so, right? And I started to think about these obstacles in kind of different categories. One of them is limited capabilities of the researchers themselves, right? And the first one that comes to mind here is the language barriers, obviously. So I'm from Turkey, obviously I can speak Turkish and, you know, understand the Turkish local newspapers, etc. But that's not necessarily the case for everyone who wants to study, you know, conflict in Turkey. So researchers obviously need to have really competent knowledge, well, you know, solid knowledge of the local language to be able to understand the archives, talk to the respondents, you know, connect with local experts, etc., etc. And I think this is particularly important obstacle for like relatively less widely studied contexts, like small settings or not, you know, very widely studied countries, because most of the most useful written resources about these contexts can be written by local experts in the local language, right? So without knowing that language, you can't really get the perspective of the local experts on the case. So first one is limited capabilities of the researchers, like language, I think, is the first one. The second one, I think, is the limited resources available to researchers to access local knowledge. And as you all know, time is limited, funds are limited to travel and spend like a fair amount of time in different localities. I mean, sometimes even if you are at an institution where the funds are available, there are a lot of pressures for, you know, I don't know, teaching, advising, and other administrative stuff that you are supposed to do, both as a faculty and as a graduate student. There are time pressures of, you know, writing your job micro people, getting out the door, etc., etc. So then, you know, both time and funds is very scarce resource. This, I think, can really prevent or pose a big obstacle for a lot of researchers who would ideally like to, you know, immerse themselves in the local setting. And then the third kind of category I thought about is the limited opportunities for researchers to access local knowledge. And this can be because sometimes government restrictions to access potentially sensitive archival material, right? And especially in countries that are going through or have gone through conflict, the archives might not be as well established and accessible as they would be in like Western European democracies, for example, right? So these restrictions can deter a lot of people who are interested in understanding that or studying that particular setting to even be, you know, deterred from even trying to do so because they suspect that it will be hard to access sensitive resources for them. And the final obstacle that I want to highlight within this category of limited opportunities is related to connections and collaboration with local NGOs, government agencies, or local researchers, local universities. Again, I think if you are from that context, this is much easier, right? You might have colleagues you know from even college. You might have friends that you have connected over the years from the conferences because you are from the same country, right? But for people who are kind of, not from that context, I think establishing collaboration, establishing good working relationship with locally rooted experts is kind of a obstacle. It's not super easy, I think, and I think these kind of events are wonderful for that, and obviously international conferences are wonderful for that as well. But these are kind of what I think overall about this particular question. Professor Carter, did you have anything to add for this one?
Just a few points. So I mean that was a really nice summary of, I think, some of the some of the main challenges to accessing local knowledge and connecting with local scholars. I think that perhaps forums like this can be a useful way to help to build networks, right? Because one thing that is sort of clear, I think, across a lot of different types of research in conflict studies is that the model of a single researcher sort of working on a project, in his or her office or like university library alone, for a lot of these kinds of projects, trying to implement a survey in the field or collect sort of new data, from a local NGO that is, trying to code incidents of, government repression. This requires, access to local knowledge, and it also, I think, often implies that we need to be, co-authoring, not only with, teams of co-authors on projects, but kind of different kinds of teams of co-authors, right? Where, we break out of our sort of typical network of the 10 or 15 scholars that, have kind of grown up working on the same topics, and, we're all on the same ISA panels together year after year, right? But we need to be able to collaborate more widely with scholars that have an expertise in local context. And that's hard because we become kind of entrenched in our existing settings and networks. And collaboration on projects, co-authorship, these are sort of high stakes, consequential relationships. So they're hard to develop, on the fly or quickly, so to speak. But I think we do need innovative new forums to connect scholars, from St. Louis or Chicago or New York to scholars in Turkey or in Abuja, Nigeria, or where different contexts around the world that we're trying to learn from and incorporate into our research. And so an example that I can give from a project that I'm on with, it's an interdisciplinary project here at Washington University, where we're working to understand how sort of different sources of trust in government, and some of those sources are more sort of contemporaneous, so people's trust in government can shift with partisanship, or you can sort of see how the government is managing the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, and change your assessment of the government, how much you trust the incumbent government based on that performance. But then there are also sort of deeply rooted sort of structural historical sources of trust or lack of trust, right? So a history of a certain region, having sub-state conflict, or a particular population being historically repressed, or an area of the country that has historically had less state presence, because it's in more peripheral, far away from the capital. And there are a number of additional sort of things I could note, right? And so how do these sort of structural versus more sort of individual level sort of ways of understanding trust or trust deficits sort of affect strategies we might use to try to affect trust in government, and how does that impact outcomes like in individuals' propensity to follow public health advice from the government. So that's a quick overview of the project, and we're very much intent on implementing this project in a variety of settings around the world, especially outside of the United States and Europe, where because there's just better data in Western Europe, for example, on all dimensions. We know a lot more about these contexts than we do about Nigeria. And so one of the members of our team has done some randomized controlled trials in the medical sphere in Nigeria. And so we had sort of connections to work there, and that's a really important and interesting context that, from teaching, I know a little bit about, but I certainly wouldn't call myself a local expert. And it was clear that we needed to connect with, local scholars from universities in Nigeria to discuss and bring them into the project and learn. But how would I do that? I don't have those networks. I'm not sure. I'm just emailing people that I know that have worked in West Africa, getting responses, but it's all sort of within my own network that I'm casting about, looking for collaborators or ways to sort of connect to local context. And it in this case arose from the medical school professor that we're working with. One of his medical school colleagues knew political scientists at the University of Abuja that he connected us with. Right. And, that proved to be really helpful in sort of clarifying, the sources of mistrust in Nigeria that sort of connected to our, sort of general theoretical interest that we were pursuing in the project. But if I'd been on my own, I don't think I would have made those connections, because I just wouldn't have had those sort of network connections sort of anywhere to be found. Perhaps I would have muddled along and found people to collaborate with, but it just got me to thinking about how, as you cast your net wider with a larger number of collaborators that have more connections to institutions all around the world and include collaborators from institutions all around the world, that opens up all kinds of possibilities for, doing better, higher quality research on how public trust affects vaccine hesitancy in different areas of Nigeria, for example, right? And, more comfortably taking, research out of, study in Germany, which is sort of much easier to do from my perspective, to these very important cases that, I think tapping into local knowledge is quite important to sort of moving forward over. So that's just a sort of a story from a research project that I've been engaged in that I thought connects to some of the points that Professor Aksoy is making.
Okay, so the third broad theme that we want to talk about is striking a balance between incorporating local perspectives and theories while ensuring academic rigor and cross-cultural understanding. So how can we combine or strike a balance between local perspectives and academic rigor? I mean, one of the things that I always advise my graduate students, and also I try to do myself as much as I can, is reading across disciplines. So, obviously we are political scientists, but the topics and questions that we are interested in understanding have also been studied by scholars in anthropology, sociology, psychology, economy, etc., history. So I think one of the ways in which we can kind of like combine the local perspectives to academic rigor is reading widely across different disciplines that use different methods than us, right? Some of these studies, like anthropological studies, might be heavily qualitative, right? But they will probably provide like a richer, more locally contextually informed background information or fundamental information about the context that we want to understand. I mean, I encountered this in one of my projects that I'm working on about women's participation in armed movements. This topic is studied by political scientists as well as, you know, like people from other disciplines, but I think political science research on this topic is relatively more recent, more, you know, newer than, for example, anthropological or sociological research on this. And I mean, one of the most inspiring books that I have read on this topic was written by a sociologist, Jocelyn Viterna. It's a completely qualitative, really in-depth sociological, anthropological study of El Salvador and the women in El Salvador and their participation in the armed mobilization. So sometimes like really great ideas come from reading of such work. So I think it's really important as political scientists to not just focus on political science research, but open up our you know, eyes to, like, you know, these different types of disciplines, and reading across different type of methodologies also, not just focusing on quantitative work or qualitative work only, but like reading multi-method work or, you know, qualitative research, historical research also. I think this is important to connect local knowledge, because like I think a lot of the, you know, really in-depth, you know, information about theories and different contextual information come from these like more in-depth studies, oftentimes that are written by people who are either local experts, like that's what they do. They only have studied, you know, El Salvador or Turkey or Nigeria all their life, right? So that I think is important. So reading across disciplines, different methodologies, local authors. Sometimes this can be hard, especially if experts on that region have largely written in the local language, right? Not everything is translated to English. I know a lot of books written by Turkish journalists that are not necessarily available in English, right? Or Turkish historians. But as much as possible, reading local authors is super important, and following the local news. I mean, this should be super obvious to everyone. Like international news is very limited, obviously. Only newsworthy stuff get covered. So reading local news and reading local news from multiple conflicting channels of information, I think is also useful, right? So I think to, you know, to answer the study question more quickly, like how can we strike a balance between local knowledge and academic rigor? I think reading widely, reading across discipline, reading across different methodologies, and really paying attention to local resources is super important.
One thing that I would just note, which I think can be sort of tied into the next topic that we were, you know, planning to talk about as well, which is, you know, what obstacles exist in collecting accurate and representative data in conflict-affected regions, and, you know, thinking about this in particular when it comes to the reliability and neutrality of data sources, right? And one thing that I've been grappling with a little bit in my head, and that I think about quite a lot when I'm teaching undergraduates, is, you know, trying to be aware of sort of any sort of implicit or, you know, sometimes more explicit biases that we come to when we study you know, political violence or state repression, or, you know, a wide variety of other conflict topics, right? And I think, you know, being mindful of, you know, these potential biases when we are studying a local context, or, you know, trying to learn, you know, what happened, you know, in the Civil War in Peru with the Shining Path, and, you know, what sort of local variation across territory is important to understand, right? And you know, one sort of idea about, you know, research on political violence and state repression that I think is important, you know, which relates to thinking about neutrality, is I'm reminded of Will Moore's presidential address to the Peace Science Society a number of years ago, where he pointed out that a lot of the concepts and terms that we work with are actually defined by the state and very consistent with state interests, right? And so we're scholars of political violence and state repression, but the way we talk about the concept or sort of definition of terrorism and the way we study terrorism for the most part makes it something that states just by definition don't do, right? And there might be theoretical reasons for thinking that states are different than non-state actors in some ways, but we know that there are a lot of ways in which non-state actors are not that different from states, right? The whole rebel governance literature, which has really flourished over the past decade or two, demonstrates that non-state groups that are trying to govern territory do a lot of the same things that states do, right? And obviously states do a lot of the bad things that sub-state groups do as well, like illegitimately target civilians. And so I think that's just a useful thing to keep in mind as we do research on contentious issues, which conflict research is necessarily about contentious issues, regardless of whether we're studying sub-state political violence or territorial claims between India and Pakistan, or any of the other sort of wealth of topics that we're trying to learn more about. So sort of transitioning from that sort of maybe more general point to thinking about collecting data in conflict-affected regions, there are a number of important considerations, I think, some of which are sort of obvious in general, perhaps, and some that are more sort of specific and technically oriented, right? So kind of by definition, conflict zones, even former conflict zones, are places that pose greater potential risks to researchers, and then also research assistants, survey enumerators, all of the people that are helping us to learn what happened or what's happening on the ground in a conflict. So we just have to be ultra careful and aware of the possibility of personal harm to research assistants, and also the populations that we're studying, right? And this can be harm in the form of it's dangerous for people to talk to researchers from the outside, because they might be perceived as collaborating with a group that is assumed to be of the interests of the government or of another group from a conflict setting, and that this can be something that without really learning the context and connecting with local experts, we might not be fully aware of as outside scholars. And of course, surveying individuals who have experienced conflict, or whose friends or people in their personal network, family members who have experienced conflict, can also just inflict emotional harm, right? So we have IRB processes that, of course, are important to trying to minimize or do away with the possibility of harm to research subjects. But beyond just sort of checking those boxes and jumping through the bureaucratic hoops, I think we just need to think really carefully about these contexts and try to learn as much as we can, from local NGOs, activists, and also scholars that are sort of more close to the ground, so to speak, to minimize this potential for harm. So that's sort of one point that I think is very general to understanding or doing research in conflict zones. Another is the degree to which we the questions we're asking, and this is something that I have thought about a lot in some of the research that I've done or am working on, where I'm interested in sort of understanding how localities have been affected by border changes, or have experienced state fortification of border institutions, or hardening of borders in a border region, how these regions differ from other similar regions that maybe haven't experienced the same kind of volatility or sort of ramping up of state presence in the form of border fortifications, right? And so one way to sort of understand, how does this affect, individuals living in border regions? How does it affect their perceptions of the government or of, the population and governing authority across the border? I've thought a lot about implementing surveys that sort of target or oversample border regions. But it's, really hard part of this kind of research is that it's expensive and it's difficult to do. And it's exceedingly expensive to, in most settings, get a representative local sample. So like even in the context of St. Louis, right? Like, so St. Louis, Missouri, you want to get a representative local sample of, a small portion of St. Louis County. That's going to cost you a lot more money paying to a survey firm than a nationally representative sample of the United States, right? Which is much easier to do. And so I think this is something that we need to think about, because not all questions can be answered by just, randomizing within convenient samples. But sometimes we really do want to, have a more representative idea of, not just, how do people respond to, some kind of a treatment and a survey experiment, but what is local sentiment about, what the government is doing, building state presence at the border? What do they, is this something that is generally, changed public opinion in these border regions relative to these others? And this requires a different approach that I think, again, it's hard for, for someone that is, not sort of embedded in the context, to fully implement. And there are sort of technical solutions to these problems as well. So things like MRP, where you can use census data to try to essentially impute, based on more sparse survey data, what a particular region, a county or a province, what public opinion would look like, leveraging the fact that you have a bunch of survey data nationally that you can connect to census data, and how someone with my demographics or someone with Ilker's demographics answers an item, and then what a local area looks like in terms of those demographics, and you can kind of just to explain quickly, you can impute in some way, but that obviously relies on good census data, which is often lacking for obvious reasons in conflict regions, right? So Melissa Lee's work, even, with Nan Zhang, sort of leverages the fact that, inaccurate census data is a function of a lack of state capacity, which is often, related to armed conflict being present in a region, right? So these are hard things, but I think they're things that we need to continually think more about. So just to sort of cap off the two things I talked about, thinking about, our biases as we enter, kind of any study of armed conflict, I think is important. And then, thinking about, how we can conduct our research thoughtfully without, doing harm to anyone involved in the research process, or, even sort of bringing that risk to the table. And then, trying to think of ways to do a better job taking seriously local dynamics in terms of, what does this locality, look like in terms of public opinion? Can we move beyond just, how does a convenient sample respond to a treatment without being able to say anything really about, how representative it is or is not of local dynamics relative to how things look in the sort of center of the country, in the capital region, for example. So Deniz, I don't know if Professor Aksoy has some thoughts to add here as well. I feel like I should probably stop there and allow her to pick up the thread.
I hope we are doing good in time, but I have 3 things to add. I agree with lots of things that Professor Carter mentioned. The 3 things I want to add. The first one, he talked about the difficulty of like getting a representative sample. Imagine, I want to take it one step further and say that even if you have picked a sample area that you feel confident this is going to give you a representative sample, in a conflict setting, the conflict dynamics can make that area inaccessible, right? Or it is possible that because of the conflict dynamics, people in that area will move out of the region also. So even if you have successfully picked a sample region in a conflict setting, it's hard, it can be all of a sudden very difficult to access that population because of movement of people. The second thing I wanted to mention is again, to build upon what Professor Carter mentioned, a lot of the questions we want to study are really sensitive questions in these settings, so people might feel fearful and hesitant to answer them. But one of the, luckily, like we have, I think, better ways of like asking people more sensitive questions. For those of you who are interested in some of these methods, like looking into endorsement experiments or list experiments, which allow researchers to ask sensitive questions in subtle manners, I think have been really, really important in this space, in the conflict studies space. The third thing I want to build on is that, as Professor Carter mentioned, there are biases in conceptualization of some of the topics that we want to study, like terrorism. And on top of that, there are biases in reporting as well, right? There are studies which show that, for example, in the Ukraine war right now, if we analyze the conflict dynamics using data provided from the Ukrainian news sources, Russian news sources, versus a third-party independent source, and code the events, code the armed actors' actions, the research results might be completely different, right? So I mean, this is a hard problem to deal with, but maybe like one way to move forward can be like to test our arguments and hypotheses using multiple sources of data from multiple resources might be one minor way in which we can kind of deal with this problem. Move on for the sake of time also to our, I think, final question, which was about the digital age and availability of media and online sources. Let me read so it's more clear to the listeners here. In the age of digital information, what challenges and opportunities are associated with using social media and online sources as data for conflict studies, and how can we verify authenticity of such data? Again, a hard question, but excellent question. I mean, all of you are aware that increasingly we see studies conducted using data scraped from, Twitter or currently X, Facebook, etc. And this is kind of like a double-edged sword, obviously. I see a ton of opportunities here because these social media channels really provide us with massive amounts of information, right? Massive amounts of information about both like armed actors' behaviors, right? The propaganda they put online, for example, governments' behaviors, legislators, members of the parliament, what they say, what they claim, how hawkish, how dovish they behave online, and also like citizens' behaviors as well, all right? Do they click a like on an armed group's propaganda video, what they post, etc., etc.? There are just like endless amount of information available here, which was not imaginable, I think, before Web 2.0, I guess. Another opportunity here is that technological advances, like our ability to scrape websites, have really allowed us to very, very quickly gather and code massive amounts of data that was not possible by human coding. So this data can be scraped from, it doesn't even have to be like social media, right? It can be government websites, like official statements, speeches from legislators, insurgent groups' websites, you know, what they say about government, etc. So this doesn't have to be only social media, but we can gather a lot of large bodies of data from official sources and quickly turn them into data. And the final opportunity, I think a lot of the historical political economy people have been using is like, you know, digitizing old archival documents. These can be old Chinese, you know, civil servant exams, right? To maybe Ottoman era documents that are, you know, sitting in archives somewhere collecting dust. Now we have ways to digitize these resources, even visual resources like old maps, and digitalize them and turn them into data. So these are, I think, wonderful opportunities. But the challenges are also abound. I mean, as the question also hints at, authenticity, right? There are a lot of bots on the online world. How do we know whether or not these are actually individuals who are making the posts? People can say many things online that they don't necessarily mean, right? We don't know how they act outside of the online world. We don't know if online world is really like the real world. And also sometimes I think it is also overwhelming to have this much data and try to make sense of it. What aspects of this information is relevant? What aspects of it should we code? What is relevant? What is not relevant? I think is difficult to clearly figure out. And I mean, maybe one way in which we can kind of balance the benefits, disadvantages and advantages, is to supplement this more social media or online-based data with more data collected through traditional ways. You know, again, if you have an idea, if you have a theory, if you have a theoretical argument, you can you test it using more traditional forms of data, and then can you supplement that analysis with data collected from online sources, and what similarities do we observe? So maybe thinking about these sources of data as complementary to one another as much as possible can be useful. Professor Carter, did you have anything else to add here? We can also move on to question and answers to give our audience a chance to participate.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to just take questions at this point. I don't have anything essential to add, I don't think.
So professors, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. And so I must acknowledge you have answered all of our questions widely. I don't know if I can raise any further questions, but before I leave the floor for a Q&A session, so I want to make an announcement. We have spent almost all of the time we have, but I suggest we move on for another 15 minutes for Q&A session. And so I'll start the questions myself. So I have two questions, very quick ones. So you have already answered these questions, but in a nutshell, how would you rate the current landscape of conflict research in terms of accessing local knowledge and cooperation between Global South and North? And, you know, as a follow-up question to this one, in what directions do you think we are heading in terms of cooperations? I mean, are we heading towards more cooperation or less cooperation? And maybe if you would like to give a sense of an ideal world, you know, how would an ideal cooperation look like in an idealized world? I know you have already given some examples of yours, you know, what are the challenges and how these challenges could be solved. So this will be my questions. And for the audience, if you have any questions, you can use the chat feature. You can write your answers, or if you would like to raise your questions yourself, please raise your hand or, you know, unmute yourself and ask your questions after, you know, our speakers answering these two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with just two quick points. So I think in terms of, you know, what the landscape looks like in terms of, collaboration between, scholars and, others that are important to conflict research, between the global north and global south, so to speak. I think the landscape is better than it was, a decade or two ago, in part because it's easier, for people to communicate and, be sort of face to face, like, what we're doing right now. Certainly relative to when, I started graduate school about 20 years ago. And I also think that the sort of variety of changes that have happened in political science research, social science research more generally, that have affected conflict research have brought, more scholarly focus to, doing work in the field. It used to be that, field research, going to a place that was relevant to your topic of study, that, wasn't just like going to the archives in Washington, D.C. or Brussels or London, but, maybe going to rural India to, try to really understand, the context of the Naxalite insurgency. Like that was something that, qualitative comparativists did, in that field research exercise. But, quantitative conflict scholars, certainly IR scholars, it was very unusual to be considering even doing work like that. But that's really changed, I think, as scholars have started to, implement, survey research in the field, and, that have become more interested in, trying to more credibly identify effects in a local context, right? So I think the landscape is better, but I guess I would just say that it's important to think about connections between, scholars in the global north and global south, as you phrased it, uh, more in terms of collaborators rather than just, these are relationships of convenience once you finish the survey or, sort of collect the data, you sort of go your separate ways. But I think the collaboration would benefit from being, more substantial at all stages of the project, so to speak. So I had one more thing I was going to say, but I think I'll sort of give the floor to Professor Aksoy to not.
I agree with the points that Professor Carter is making here. I mean, I agree that there's more opportunities. The landscape looks much better than 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And this is partly due to turn to like valuing single country, subnational type of research increasingly. Again, like when I was in grad school also, like it was, I don't know, really extremely rare that you would see a paper in APSR that's written solely on, I don't know, Turkey or any other, country setting, single country studies. So subnational research, I think, opens up a lot of opportunities for, these kind of collaborations. And the second point I think I want to add is that I think maybe increasingly, both like local experts and global experts, I don't know if that's the correct term, but people who are in and out of the local context maybe are increasingly speaking similar academic languages, right? We all acknowledge, I think there are more people who now acknowledge the value of understanding local context very well, maybe qualitative, quantitative, multi-method approach. Outside of the local context, there are more people like that. And in the local context is also, I think, the importance of using quantitative data, statistics, not, just seeing them as, like a totally different type of research, but understanding that these methods are serving the similar purpose. It's more common to find local experts who speak similar academic language to people outside of the context, right? Respect for multi-method approach and both combining quantitative and qualitative research. I think when there's a divide in what type of academic language we should speak. If one side is solely doing like historical research, other side is doing completely on the desk statistical work, it's hard to form those connections. But I think increasingly there's kind of more convergence into the value of multi-method research, which I think facilitates collaboration as well. So I see the direction in a positive way as well.
Thank you for your answers. I think, on that point, Professor Aksoy, we have one question in the chat. So Deniz, our MA student in International Relations Department, asked, to what extent do you think using quantitative research methods through local sources or data in conflict studies can be effective in terms of conflict resolution processes?
Okay, I mean, okay. So to what extent using quantitative research methods through local sources? So I think this is as opposed to data collected through international sources. I imagine that's the question. Is it better to use local data collected through local sources versus international sources? There are trade-offs, I think, in each. And I think, like I mentioned before, as much as possible, it is very fruitful to test our arguments using data collected through different types of sources, right? Like in the example that I mentioned with the Ukraine and Russia, data can be gathered from Ukrainian sources, Russian sources, third-party sources. If our ideas and theories kind of align regardless of what source we use, that's kind of interesting. If it doesn't, that's also interesting. Then we need to think about why is this happening, what kind of biases exist, etc. So I think collecting data through local sources is valuable, totally, but I can't claim that that is the most effective way to go forward necessarily, right? All of these sources of data, all of these methods are, I think, complementary to one another. We can't, I don't know, maybe we can't focus solely on one and claim that this is the most effective way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this brings us back to our original question, striking a balance between local knowledge and rigor academic research. So I think we have to be careful with any data. So it doesn't mean local data is always the ideal data source. So we have another question from Dr. Tokdemir. Doctor, in the chat, again, you can see it yourself as well, but I'll read it for the audience. Even though we all seek for local connections and collaborations whenever we conduct a research abroad, can you think of a more organized way to connect with each other or to facilitate the collaboration among scholars all over the world?
Yeah. I think, one way I think people have been trying to do this is through networks like EGAP, as I have mentioned before. You have a research project idea. I think they even have like little funds and grants and programs you can apply your project to. And so networks like that can, help you connect with maybe local experts on the ground, especially if this is in places that they already have been working on. I think it's easier. But if the connections you want to form are with local experts from a really hardly studied region, I think it's more of a challenge. But one way I think is one way of this like more organized way to connect is kind of plugging into these already established global networks like EGAP is one way, I think. What other more organized ways to connect with each other? I mean, like I think everybody knows this, but conferences, international conferences are really important for that as well. I think, looking at conference programs, seeing who studies what, if there are connections to what you want to do or the region you want to do, going to those panels and introducing yourself and like meeting people that way is very valuable. And maybe most importantly, like smaller workshops, I think are even better for networking. I think NYU Abu Dhabi, for example, has a event that they organize to which they bring people who want to do experimental research. I imagine if you go to such an event from Europe or the US, you have an opportunity to meet people who study the Middle East, for example, right? So these small workshops, bigger conferences, and plugging into the already existing networks like EGAPT can be some of the organized ways that come to mind right now.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would just say also to Efe's question that I think some forums where we connect with people that we maybe just we don't know, or don't have some connection to people that we already know. I don't know what those forums are. Would be helpful, because it's so going to different conferences is great, but it's it's costly, and it's it's expensive in terms of time, and you have to leave your your family life or whatever for several days. And then it's the easiest thing to do when you go to a conference is just to connect with the people that you know already and haven't seen for a while. So I do have this sense that it's hard to sort of break out of one's pre-existing group or network, and to really you know get to know scholars that are working on the same topics that you are. um but you don't know them. And they maybe have more connection to local context you're interested in, and it would be a fruitful connection to make, but it often just isn't, for a variety of reasons. So I'm not sure, like forums like this on Zoom, but then it can be everyone is doing a lot of things all the time. People have time constraints, so it's not easy to credibly sign up for a bunch of new um, online workshops either, even though they're easier to get to than in-person workshops. So that's something I think as a community we we identify it as a problem. We're talking about it now, but um, the solutions to me are not immediately obvious. So we need something innovative that would also, people would be attracted to sort of break out of their sort of pre-existing routines and networks.
I mean, another thing to add that come to my mind, like I've been observing this with some of my graduate students. They very early on, like if they study on a particular region, like let's say China, they have like in these bigger conferences, they start forming a network of like scholars or students, graduate students who study Chinese politics, and then they connect with scholars who study Chinese politics, who are faculty members, etc. So it seems like they try to form those networks, I mean, largely in the US though. For example, I'm not sure for Turkish, study for scholars who are interested in study Turkey, for example, I shouldn't say Turkish scholars necessarily. If there's such a network, I'm not sure. But I know that there are a lot of Turkish scholars and scholars who are not Turkish who are studying Turkey and the conflict in Turkey or the politics in Turkey, etc. So these kind of like groups, I think, can be useful. An example of that is ALIMS, AALIMS, like it's more broad about Muslim societies, but I think anyone who studies on Middle East kind of like try to plug into that network and get to know each other, both scholars in the US and scholars in Middle East.
Thank you very much. I think so. we don't have enough time for more questions, but I don't see any other questions in the chat either, so that's good news. On the behalf of the center and the journal, Azimuth, I would like to thank you for taking time to deliver a talk on this very important topic, and we thank all the audience for joining in. I would like to make an announcement also. It's in the chat box. Our upcoming conference workshop will be on March 6th. We will host Professor Sian Loy and Sedan Akçınarlıoğlu on the topic of cooperation between Global North and Global South. So we will talk about the cooperation potential ways of exploring cooperation between scholars around the world. Thank you again, professors. If you don't have any final comments, we can close the session.
Yeah,
I
thank you
just
so
want to take a moment to thank, yes, thank you, or to organizers, to participants, for all your efforts to put together such a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And you know, thank you for provoking us to think more about these important issues.
Thank you very much.